I remember the first time I noticed her, though I didn't know it at the time. It was a Thursday, gray and drizzly, the kind of Thursday that makes the smell of wet asphalt sharper, more present. I was leaning against the counter of the small, cluttered bookstore where I worked part-time, thumbing through a dog-eared copy of East of Eden when she walked in. She moved differently than anyone else, measured, deliberate, like she wasn't in a hurry but still had somewhere important to be. Her heels clicked against the worn wooden floor. Not loud enough to be annoying, just loud enough to make me look up. She had that kind of presence that doesn't demand attention but somehow takes it anyway. I noticed the subtle gray at her temples first, and then the way her hands lingered over the leather-bound novels, as if she was reading them by touch. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, trying not to sound like I'd been staring. She looked up, eyes dark and steady, and smiled. Not the quick, polite bookstore smile, but the kind that suggests she already knows a secret you don't. "I'm looking for something that feels like it might change me," she said, and for a moment I thought she was quoting something. Maybe she was. I cleared my throat. "We might have that in philosophy or poetry." My voice sounded small even to me, like it didn't belong in the space between us. She tilted her head, considering, and then, without another word, she let her fingers brush across the spines as if each one held a pulse she could feel. I watched, feeling a strange, electric tug in my chest. Awkward, unfamiliar. There was nothing sexual in the room, nothing deliberate, yet everything was charged, like we were both aware of some current running between us that had nothing to do with anyone else. For a moment, silence fell. The rain outside pressed against the windows in steady drumming, and she glanced at the small cafe corner tucked in the back, the one I usually ignored on slow afternoons. "Coffee?" she asked, almost casually. I swallowed. "Yes, sure." We sat at a small table with chipped edges, the smell of espresso thick and slightly bitter. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything at first. She spoke instead, talking about a book she loved decades ago, her voice calm, confident, like she had lived through more than most people I knew and carried it lightly, without heaviness. I nodded, laughed in the right places, and felt my hands fidget with the rim of my cup, because I wanted her to notice I was listening, not just hearing, really listening. Then she paused, mid-sentence, to reach across and lift a small sugar packet I'd dropped. Her fingers brushed mine. A spark, maybe imagined, maybe not, traveled from her touch to mine. She didn't pull back immediately. Neither did I. The rain outside seemed to fade, the rest of the bookstore slipping from my awareness. I only noticed her, the way her eyes softened, the faint curve of her lips, the quiet certainty in her posture. "I should go," she said after a while, finally standing. "Don't wait for me." I wanted to say something clever, something that would make her stay, but all I could manage was a whisper, almost to myself. "Then, who am I waiting for?" She smiled again, small, knowing, and left. And even as I restacked the books she'd touched, the imprint of her presence lingered, like the heat from a cup you've put down too quickly. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her fingers lingered on mine. The next time I saw her, it was in the same bookstore, though somehow it felt different, quieter, like the air itself was holding its breath. She was crouched by the back shelf, trying to wrestle a stack of oversized art books into a precarious pile. "Here, let me help," I said, stepping closer before she could respond. My hands moved instinctively, and suddenly we were arranging the books together, our fingers brushing now and then. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at me either. She sighed, a soft, almost inaudible sound, and I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the faint dark circles under her eyes, the way she shook her head as if she couldn't quite shake off some weight. She had this quiet restraint, a careful wall she kept between herself and the world, and I couldn't help but be drawn to it. "You work here often?" she asked, her voice clipped, neutral. Not cold, exactly, but distant. Enough to know how easily these things topple. I replied, attempting lightness. She didn't smile. Not immediately. She just adjusted a book, then pressed her palms to the counter and leaned back slightly, as if letting me see her fatigue for just a flicker of a moment. It was subtle, but I saw it. The way her fingers trembled slightly when she straightened a spine, how her jaw tightened, how her eyes flicked to the clock as if time were moving too fast. I wanted to say something comforting, something that might ease that tension, but I stayed quiet, letting my gaze linger without pressing. She noticed, though. She glanced up briefly, just enough for our eyes to meet for a heartbeat. Her lips quirked, half amused, half wary, and then she looked away again. "Thanks," she muttered softly, the word floating between us, fragile and unclaimed. There was a quiet honesty in it, and I felt it like a spark, small but persistent. I wanted to reach out, to bridge that distance, but instead I just nodded, letting the moment hang. When she finally straightened fully, adjusting her coat, there was a slight pause. I noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the faint crease on her forehead that vanished when she relaxed her brow, the subtle tremor of her hands as she gathered her bag. Little details, but each one made her feel more real, more layered. As she stepped toward the door, the autumn light filtering through the bookstore windows catching her hair in soft gold, I found myself holding my breath. She hesitated at the threshold, a glance over her shoulder that lasted a second too long, enough to make my heart skip, enough to make me notice how quietly alive the space between us had become. "I'll see you," she said, trailing off, leaving the sentence unfinished, and it landed in the air like a question I wasn't ready to answer. She left, and I stayed behind, hands brushing against the books she had touched, feeling the echo of her presence. That pause at the door, her almost glance, her unfinished words, stuck with me. It was a quiet pull, a gentle tug I didn't understand yet, and I realized I was already waiting for the next time I'd see her. It was past 9 when the last customer left, leaving the bookstore in a kind of suspended quiet, the only sound the occasional patter of rain against the windows. She was perched on a stool behind the counter, absently flipping through a notebook, and I was restacking a display of new arrivals. Somehow, the space between us felt charged, small sparks flickering every time our eyes met. "You ever get tired of all this?" I asked quietly, nodding toward the towers of books. She glanced up, her lips pressed in that almost smile that made it impossible to tell if she was teasing or serious. "Every day," she admitted. "But then I remember why I'm here." Her voice was calm, measured, but I caught the tremor in her fingers as she closed the notebook. I stepped closer under the pretense of moving a leaning stack, and suddenly our hands hovered over the same book. Neither of us moved away. I felt the heat of her skin through the thin leather of her gloves. A weird, impossible tension thrummed in my chest, and I swallowed, reminding myself that she was older, complex, someone I shouldn't be wanting like this. She exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with something. Vulnerability? Curiosity? Guilt? Before she looked away to the rain-slicked street. The dim light reflected in her eyes, making them seem deeper, distant in a way that drew me in further. A sudden ping from her phone made her start, and I saw her face tighten, the faint shadow of tension returning. She swiped a notification away. I didn't ask, didn't need to. Some other life, other complications, intruded on our fragile bubble. I wanted to reach out, brush her hair from her face, tell her that none of that mattered in this moment, but I didn't. I couldn't. "You okay?" I murmured, trying to sound casual. She gave a small, tight-lipped smile. "I'm fine. Just people calling at the wrong time." The storm outside picked up, and thunder rumbled low, echoing the irregular rhythm of my heartbeat. I stepped slightly closer, drawn by a force I didn't fully understand, and she didn't move back. Not immediately. Not until the light flickered and the old fuse box hummed a warning. Her hand brushed against mine, not on purpose, not yet, but enough that the warmth lingered. For a split second, I felt like I could lean in, just a little, and see if she'd lean back. My mind screamed at me, rationally, morally, socially. But every fiber of me, the longing, the curiosity, the subtle obsession I was only just noticing, pulled toward her. She shifted suddenly, pulling her hand back under the table, and the spell broke. Her gaze dropped to her notebook again, pen scratching quietly, erasing the moment before it could exist. I stayed where I was, heart pounding, breathing too fast, pretending to straighten the display while feeling the impossible weight of proximity pressing down on me. I wanted to speak, to say the words that hovered on the tip of my tongue, but they would have been wrong, or premature, or dangerous. And yet, for a heartbeat, I imagined what might have happened if the world had been quieter, if the rain had paused, if no phones buzzed, if no rules or histories existed between us. I imagined leaning just a little closer, and then she looked up, meeting my gaze with that unreadable expression. That almost glance, that pause, left my chest tight, leaving me suspended between restraint and desire, wishing, without admitting it, that I could cross the line. The bookstore was empty again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, staring out the window at the gray drizzle. I hovered nearby, unsure whether to break the quiet or let it stretch, knowing that either choice might change everything. What are we doing?" she finally said, her voice low, almost brittle. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The words hung in the air like smoke, filling every corner. I swallowed, heart thudding. I don't know," I admitted, though my voice sounded small even to me. I wanted to reach out, to explain, to make sense of the pull I felt toward her, but the words felt inadequate, clumsy, and entirely wrong. She turned, finally, and for a moment her eyes met mine. There was no flirtation there, no warmth, really, just raw, unfiltered questioning. A look that said she was trying to understand herself, and maybe me, and failing at both. Her lips pressed together, holding back something she didn't want to say aloud. I noticed everything. The slight trembling of her hands, the way her shoulders tightened as if bracing herself for impact, the shadow under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well in days. For a moment, I thought about stepping closer, about letting the tension between us resolve in some tangible way, but instead I stayed, frozen, aware that any movement might shatter something fragile. "I can't pretend this is normal anymore," she whispered, almost to herself. "I keep thinking I should act like it's just nothing, but it isn't nothing." Her gaze dropped, tracing the scuffed floor as if searching for a place to hide from what she'd just said. I swallowed again. "It isn't nothing," I said softly. "I know." The words felt almost too heavy to hold. I wanted to fill the space with something. Anything, but the silence pressed in, demanding honesty instead of noise. We didn't move. We didn't speak. We just existed in the small space between the counter and the stacks of books, the drizzle outside drumming against the windows like a metronome counting off the seconds we couldn't reclaim. I felt my pulse in my throat, in my fingertips, in the way my chest tightened every time her eyes flicked toward mine. Then she said it, the line that would linger, unspoken between us for days, weeks maybe. "I'm scared of what I want, because I don't think I should." Her confession, soft and raw, echoed in the empty room, and I realized there was nothing I could say to fix it, to clarify it, to make it easier. The words landed like stones in my chest, and for a long moment, I just stared at her, silent, feeling the gravity of her fear, her restraint, her truth. And yet, despite everything, the rules, the history, the distance, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had come to something neither of us could name, something dangerous and magnetic and utterly alive. I wanted to tell her it was okay, but the only thing I could do was stand there, letting her silence speak, knowing it said more than anything words ever could. I found her sitting on the worn armchair in the corner of the bookstore, a faded photograph clutched in her hands. The afternoon sunlight spilled in through the window, catching the dust motes like tiny sparks, but the room felt heavier somehow, weighted by her presence. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked without looking up, her voice quieter than the rain starting again outside. I hesitated, unsure what she meant, and she finally raised her eyes to mine, storm gray, steady, almost vulnerable. "The what?" I asked, careful, because I didn't want to misstep. "This." She lifted the photograph, a younger version of herself, smiling with someone I didn't recognize. "All of it." Letting him go. Walking away. Her fingers traced the edge of the photo, tremulous. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed. I swallowed hard. There was a pause, the kind of silence that isn't empty but thrumming with unspoken things. I wanted to say something easy, comforting, but nothing came. Instead, I leaned on the counter, my hands tightening slightly, trying to ground myself. "You loved him?" I asked finally. My voice was small, careful. She nodded, eyes glimmering, not from anger, not from bitterness, but from a quiet, aching loss. I thought I could survive it, that I could move on. And I did mostly. But some days, she let the sentence hang, unfinished, and I could see it in her posture. The slump of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, that some part of her never really let go. I hesitated, then offered softly, "You remind me of someone I lost too." Not in words, not directly, just a truth hovering in the air, fragile and heavy. Her gaze flicked to me, sharp, curious, like she didn't know whether to be hurt or grateful. She breathed in slowly, almost shuddering, then placed the photograph on the armrest beside her. "I think maybe that's why I'm afraid," she said. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as she reached for a cup of coffee I hadn't noticed she'd made, and the contact sparked a warmth that made my chest tighten. "Afraid that I'll care too much, and it'll hurt like it did before." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "That's normal," I whispered. "It's human. And still, look at you. You're here. You're alive. You're you." My voice faltered, because I wanted to say more, but the words felt too fragile to risk spilling out. She laughed softly, a quiet, almost sad sound, shaking her head. "You always say the right things, don't you?" She glanced down at the photograph again, and then back at me. "But you don't know the half of it." I didn't need her to explain. I could see it in the way her hands trembled, in the tight line of her jaw, the shadows under her eyes. Pain and strength, history and now, all tangled in ways that made her magnetic and impossibly real. I wanted to reach for her, to say something, anything, that could erase the ghosts between us, but instead I let the silence stretch. And yet, when she finally looked at me, a single tear sliding down her cheek, I felt something shift inside me, soft, seismic, almost terrifying in its intensity. That moment, her raw, unguarded glance, the tremor in her hand, stayed with me long after the photograph had returned to her bag, long after the rain had stopped. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about her. It was late when we found ourselves back in the bookstore, alone except for the hum of the old heater and the occasional groan of the floorboards. Outside, rain had returned, a steady drum against the windows, but inside, everything felt suspended in a quiet, shared rhythm. She was sitting cross-legged on the worn rug near the counter, a book open in her lap, but forgotten. I stood nearby, leaning against the edge of the counter, watching her trace a finger along a page absent-mindedly. We didn't speak, didn't need to, but the air between us had changed. No walls, no pretense, just presence. Finally, she looked up, eyes softer now, less guarded, carrying a vulnerability that no longer needed to be hidden. "I don't think I've allowed myself to be like this in a long time," she admitted, voice low, steady, almost fragile. She paused, searching my face as if asking permission to continue. "You mean with me?" I asked quietly, careful, because I knew this wasn't about labels or declarations. This was about honesty. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "I don't know what it is exactly, but this." Her hand shifted slightly, and I noticed the way her fingers brushed the rug, how tense her shoulders had been just minutes ago now easing. I stepped closer, unsure if I was crossing some invisible line, and she didn't pull back. I sank to the floor beside her, letting the distance between us shrink naturally. No words, no explanations, just the quiet acknowledgement that whatever this was, it existed and it mattered. Her gaze flicked down at our hands, and slowly, deliberately, our fingers intertwined. Not a dramatic gesture, not a flourish of romance, just the simple, undeniable truth that we were here, together, choosing to be. I felt the warmth of her hand seep into mine, steadying and grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. We leaned back against the shelves, silent, letting the world outside, the phone calls, the past heartbreaks, the unspoken rules, fade away. I noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the soft curve of her cheek, the small rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. And I realized, quietly, that this ordinary, unspoken closeness was enough. "Stay," she whispered, almost a question, almost a command. Not dramatic, not desperate, just gentle. I nodded. No words, no promises, just a slow, inevitable understanding. And we stayed like that, hands brushing, shoulders touching, sharing a space that had become our own. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, and the bookstore seemed to hold its breath with us. For the first time, I didn't want anything more than this quiet. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Just presence, just acceptance. And as we sat together, fingers laced, shoulders nearly touching, the soft heat of our connection settling between us, I realized something I couldn't have said aloud even if I wanted to. This was the place I was meant to be, with her, in this small, imperfect, quiet moment. No declarations, no grand gestures, just us. And that was enough. I've often thought about the moments that shape us, the ones we don't see coming. At the time, you never know how deep a small change will run until you look back and realize everything is different. If you asked me now, I would tell you that I learned the most important lesson not from what we said, but from what we didn't. We never declared love. We never gave it a name. But there was something real in how we existed together, in those moments of quiet where nothing had to be explained. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. I'm still figuring out who I am, still unsure of the boundaries I thought I understood. But that's part of it, isn't it? Love isn't a perfect thing, not like the fairy tales or the movies, where everything is resolved in one climactic moment. It's a slow, messy unfolding of who we are at our most vulnerable and our most human. I see it now, when I look back at her, at the woman who challenged my every belief and reshaped my understanding of connection. She taught me that love doesn't always fit neatly into what you expect. Sometimes it's complicated. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it just is, without needing to be more. And I learned something about myself, too. I thought I knew what I wanted. But what I needed was something different, something more subtle, something more real. I thought I was the one who needed saving. But in the end, we both found a kind of peace together, not in grand gestures, but in simply being present. She's gone now. I don't see her every day anymore. But the way we left things, that quiet understanding, that gentle pull between us, stays with me. I'm no longer waiting for something that isn't meant to be. Instead, I'm holding on to what was. The memory of it, the quiet knowledge that we chose each other in those small, fleeting moments. The truth is, we don't always get to choose when the story ends. But we do get to choose how we live in it, how we decide to show up. And sometimes, that's enough. If you've ever experienced that kind of connection, something unspoken, something soft but powerful, then you know what I mean. Sometimes, love is the hardest thing to define. But maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it worth holding on to. And if you're still wondering where that kind of connection exists, maybe it's closer than you think. Sometimes, it's just a matter of being still enough to let it find you. Thanks for being part of this story with me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What's your own version of quiet love? I'd love to hear from you.